Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode. I've been told this is the 5th episode of Ask Paul Anything. So I have a bunch of questions which have been sent in by viewers and friends of the SDP. Everyone, and welcome to another episode. I've been told this is the 5th episode of Ask Paul Anything. So I'm going to be taking questions primarily related to COVID, but of course we'll handle any question that you're interested in. And we have the very able young Democrats who are helping to support this. And once again, welcome to everyone. I hope you're keeping yourself well and healthy. And this is a special shout out to those of you who are staying at home or watching on FB on the first day of phase 2 of the lifting of the circuit breaker. So I'm going to ask our team to raise the first few questions.
So the first question that has been coming in from multiple commenters is, Prof. Paul, will you be leaving Singapore for Boston when you become the president of the ISID?
Well, thanks very much for that question, but the answer is no. That's for sure. Up to last year, the president had to travel to Boston about 3 or 4 times a year. But now post-COVID, I doubt that that will happen. You know, we're doing a lot of our meetings, board meetings, staff meetings by teleconference now. In fact, just last night, we had a teleconference to talk about research on the COVID virus that is being published in our journal. And we had infectious disease experts from Oman, from Canada, from London, and even the staff from Boston, just talking about how to prioritize the key research publications for the journal. And I didn't have to leave my living room. So I'm here for a while. Next question.
That's great. So for the next question, it comes in 2 parts by Mr. David So. The first part is, are we the first in the world to adopt a phase 2 when there are still dormitory infections? Does WHO not have guidelines on this?
Well, actually, to be fair, countries like Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, which also have large outbreaks among migrant workers living in dormitories, are also beginning to ease up on their social restrictions. You know, they have low mortality rates as well as high infection rates among the young men who work in their construction and other industries. And you know, with everything in medicine, it's got to be a trade-off between the risk versus the benefits. So you take the risk of opening up and running the risk of a resurgence of infections versus the other side, the risk of keeping the whole country locked down. I mean, even in the hospitals, in the medical field, you've got people who are waiting for so-called elective surgery, like knee surgery or hip surgery, and it's being delayed just because of you know, the postponement of elective operations. So it's kind of a tough call. But of course, the other side of the coin is that you have countries which had very low numbers of locally transmitted infections, such as New Zealand, and they were able to lift restrictions a lot earlier and look out for the occasional imported infections that came in. And that would be the ideal. If we were able to get down to 0 or 1 infections, then we wouldn't have to have this question being asked.
Thank you. For the next part of this question, asked by the same commenter, he asks, why to date, if certain actions are wrong, our medical fraternity remains silent? Over the past, only a few doctors have voiced out.
Well, you know, that's a really tough question. And, you know, part of it, I guess, is the culture that we have, where people are a bit reluctant to voice out their views in public. But I can tell you, doctors have voiced their views on numerous medical fora. You know, early on in the pandemic, the Ministry of Health set up these chat groups for the different medical school classes. I can tell you, my medical school class chat group is full of people who are really upset about masks, about PPE, about testing, about screening, and all kinds of issues. But I guess in the public, the decisions are made by the ministerial committee. And this is the face of Singapore's COVID response, which is a little bit different from SARS. You know, during SARS, the ministerial committee was in the background, And the doctors led the response. Every night we had the doctors involved in telling the public about what was going on with SARS. But unfortunately, I guess that times have changed.
Thank you. For the next question is asked by Lai Yu Huan. After having 200 to 300 daily infections in foreign worker dormitories, shouldn't the virus have spread within all the infected dorms by now? Why are the numbers still so high?
Yes, unfortunately, you're probably right. The virus is spread to most of the dorms, but in reality, there are a huge number of dorms in Singapore. There's different kinds. There's the purpose-built dorms, which are the large ones, like S11, which has got more than 20,000 people. And then you've got the factory-converted dorms, which are disused factories, which have been converted into dormitories. And you've also got shophouses in Balestier and Geylang and places like that, which have also been converted into dorms. And so what happens is that all it takes is one individual who's infected. And if people are staying very close together, there's no opportunity for them to practice social distancing, or they share bathroom facilities without access to soap and towels and dryers, then it's very easy for the virus to spread rapidly within these cramped living conditions. And when the decision was made not to quarantine contacts of migrant workers in dorms in March, unlike what happened in February with the Seletar Aerospace cluster. Now, you remember in February, there was a group of 5 workers who came down with COVID disease. And the authorities took very prompt action. What they did was they identified all the contacts, they quarantined them, and they stopped the outbreak there. But unfortunately, that wasn't done in March. And as a result of that, it was probably inevitable that the disease would continue to spread. So in fact, worse than that, the Ministry of Manpower was on record as telling the employers that they should not send asymptomatic individuals for testing, and they threatened them with removal of privileges. And that's exactly the opposite thing of what you want to do during an outbreak. You want to find every case, you want to identify the cases, you want to identify their contacts, you want to quarantine them, you want to isolate them. And because the government did what they did in March, unlike what they did in February, we have a situation similar to the cruise ship, like the Diamond Princess. And what happens there is everybody's trapped on the ship. So, but the difference here is that, in the Diamond Princess, it's a luxury cruise. So you've got people 1 or 2 per room, and you've got swimming pools, you've got all this kind of thing, and you've got stuff like that. But here you've got 10 to 15 people in a room. And all it takes is 1 or 2 people who are incubating the virus, and they are staying in a double-decker bunk, which is like 30 centimeters away from the next person. It's really easy to spread the virus that way. And so that's why it's so hard to control in these crowded dormitories. So what does this mean to us? It means that it probably will take weeks before the epidemic burns out in the dorms. And unfortunately, these poor workers are just going to get infected one by one, or they're going to become immune. So it's a huge logistic challenge. And currently the strategy seems to be to identify those who are sick, take them out of the dorms before they get complications, which is a good thing. It's a logical thing to do. Identify those who are at risk of complications, and then make sure they're treated appropriately. But unfortunately, that does not prevent the disease from spreading amongst those who have a mild illness or those who are not yet symptomatic. And so that's a really long answer to the question as to why every day we're still getting 100, 200, 300 cases in the foreign worker dormitories. It's just a really, really difficult situation to deal with at this point in time. Of course, if it had been dealt with in March, there's a high chance we wouldn't have had this kind of problem.
Thank you. So the next question is a very short one by Tiang Hock Sum Vincent. He asks, what exactly is herd immunity?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this is a term which has been bandied around a lot. A lot of people talk about it. And basically what herd immunity means, it comes from the idea of herd, a herd of cattle or a herd of animals. And the idea is that because if you have a virus that spreads among cattle or that spreads among animals, those of you who know about farming, you know that these viruses spread really quickly. unless the whole population in the herd is immune. So basically what this means is that if there is herd immunity, enough people in the population are immune to the infection so the virus doesn't spread anymore. So let me give you an example. Okay, this is what happens with dengue fever in rural parts of Southeast Asia. And they have done tests in the villages in many parts of rural Cambodia or Laos. And what they find is that everybody, by the time you're 12 or 13 years old, you've been infected with all 4 strains of dengue. So you've got dengue as a child, and if you survive, if you didn't get severe dengue and you didn't get complications, by the time you're an adult in a kampong in Cambodia, for example, almost everybody is immune. So what's the effect of that? What that means is if every adult in this kampong in Cambodia is immune, even if a mosquito which is carrying the dengue virus gets into the kampong, the virus cannot spread because there are not enough people who are susceptible to the virus who can get infected. And so the virus will just die out. And that's what people think is going to happen. Now, there's a big contrast with what happens in urban Singapore or Bangkok or KL, for example, where, you know, the kids are at home and they are just playing computer games. They don't go out, get bitten by mosquitoes. And so adults are actually not immune to dengue fever. And the result of which is you get thousands of cases of dengue in Bangkok, in KL, and in Singapore, because you have people who are not immune. So it sounds like, you know, why don't we let everybody get herd immunity? And that was what some of the European countries were talking about. But that's not a good idea, because in fact, what you're doing is you're putting these children at risk. See, can you imagine if you said, okay, if every kid in Singapore gets dengue fever, then even if 1 in 1,000 is going to get complications of dengue, that's a lot of kids who are going to get sick. So it is a bit too high a price to pay to allow herd immunity to get in just so that you protect the adults. The best kind of herd immunity, though, is when you vaccinate people. So if you have a vaccine, now, for example, say measles, now there's a very effective vaccine, the MMR vaccine, and when you give that vaccine to more than 95% of the population, then, and you maintain a vaccination rate that's a very high rate of vaccination, you don't get measles disease. You know, when we have a case of measles in the hospital, everybody gets really excited and they go and see the patient because they've never seen measles. But for an older person, you know, we get measles. I got measles. My sister got measles. My mom got measles. We all got measles around the same time. You know, because measles used to be really common, but now with vaccination, measles has disappeared, and that's because we built up the herd immunity. So that's the good kind of herd immunity you want to have, where everybody in the population was immune. Even if somebody with measles comes in, the virus is not going to spread because everybody else is immune because they've been vaccinated. Or the older people who don't get vaccinated, they had measles before, like me. So that's the kind of concept, is everybody is protected because they have immunity, either from vaccination or from previous disease. I hope that made sense.
Yes, so for the next question, we have another 2-part questions by Ramaro Perumal. Where do you think the PAP is heading with Singapore, given that they win the next GE to form the government?
Yeah, you know, this is very unfortunate, but the reality is the PAP has a very high chance of winning the next GE and forming the next government. And, you know, the disappointing thing is that they seem to be running the same old programs as before, which seem to focus on corporate welfare and ignoring the needs and aspirations of ordinary Singaporeans. So what can we do about it? Well, we can deny them a 2/3 majority by electing quality alternative party MPs from the SDP and other credible opposition parties. That way they cannot change our constitution at will, you know, deciding how come an elected president can become an unelected president can become an elected president. All these kind of constitutional changes can only be made if you have a 2/3 majority. Not only that, if we have up to more than 1/3 of the parliament being made up of alternative party members of parliament, we will have a strong system of checks and balances, and that can only strengthen our society. Furthermore, it would be more reflective of the will of the people anyway, because, you know, in every election, about 1/3 of the population vote for the alternative parties. So I think that's going to be our goal, to make sure that we deny the PAP a 2/3 majority, so they cannot just, as we say, suka amend the constitution anyhow.
So for the next part is very closely related. If you do get into parliament in the next GE, how can you make it critical for the government to listen to your policies?
Okay, that's a very good question. But the good news is that we do not have to really work at making it critical or to make it happen. Because, for all its faults, we still have a parliamentary system of democracy. And what that means is all members of parliament, whether they're from the ruling party or from the opposition, they can ask questions and the ministers have to answer them. The ministers can try and run, but they can't hide, as they say. They can avoid the question, but you can ask the same question at the next sitting of parliament. You can rephrase the question. You can ask for details, and the ministers can give you a written answer, but they have to answer. And that's the difference. You see, if you're a journalist or you're an activist or you're an independent commentator, you can raise questions till the cows come home. The ministers don't have to answer you. If you're in parliament, the ministers have to provide an answer, and they do. And that's how we can ensure that the voices of ordinary citizens are heard by the ministers. It also ensures that the ministers are held accountable, because you can't get away with just saying, oh, the salary of somebody is a top secret, and we're not going to tell you because it's not in the public interest or whatever. Because these are questions that they're going to have to answer. Whether you like the answer or not, and if you don't like the answer, you can ask the question again in a different way. So I think that's the key, to have enough representatives in parliament so that you can ask the key questions that Singaporeans are asking, and that we can get answers from the people that we have elected into parliament.
Now the next question brings us back to COVID by Cyrus LS Teo. What are the relevant precautions against the coronavirus given the confusing instructions by the multi-ministry task force?
Okay, very good question. And I keep getting asked this question again and again. But the reality is that we're learning a lot about the virus. But what we have learned so far tells us very much like what we've known right from the very beginning. This virus is similar to other respiratory viruses, and that it spreads primarily by close contact and by droplets. In certain situations, it can be aerosolized, when, like for example, during medical procedures. So what is the key to prevention? The key is good hand hygiene and mask use, especially in crowded places where you might encounter infected people. And the trouble with this virus, unlike SARS, is that people are infectious even before they have symptoms. Now with SARS, people were infectious when they were really ill in hospital. So SARS mainly affected doctors, nurses, and allied health professionals working in hospitals. But this virus is different. People have a very high virus load even before the onset of symptoms. So that's the rationale behind using masks in public places, when you're outdoors, when you're outside the home, because you never know who's going to be incubating the virus or actually having a high viral load. They might be standing next to you in a crowded MRT train. And if you're not careful, you're going to breathe in some germs, or you're going to touch something, and then you can rub your face and your eyes and your mouth and your nose, and then you get infected. So that's the reason why mask use is critical, and even more importantly, good hand hygiene, maintaining good sanitation at home or in the office and places like that. And also, it's important to seek medical attention if you're not well. Now, I know people have this phobia about the 5 days MC, and you go to jail if you go out. But the reality is, all of us work too hard. If you're not well, just take 5 days, have a good rest, get better, and then go back to work. Don't be a hero. Don't go back to work, infect everybody else in the office, and create a lot of problems. Because even though young people have generally mild disease with COVID, but older adults are vulnerable. In Singapore, the death rate is the same as in other countries in the world. Once you're over 80, there's a 15 to 20% chance of death, which is the same as they've seen in Italy and China and in other parts of the world. So we want to protect the older people who we love and we hold dear to us. And so that's the reason to make sure that we seek medical attention if we're not well, practice good hand hygiene, and use masks when we're going outdoors.
Next is a question I'm sure are on many Singaporeans' minds. Will teams be on standby in anticipation of an explosion of cases due to mass voting?
Definitely. In fact, I can tell you again, going back to my class chat group from my medical school class, many of us in the medical community are apprehensive about a resurgence of infections, especially just with the lifting of phase 2. So can you imagine what's going to happen if people are going door to door, from house to house, giving out flyers, trying to make contact, talking with people, explaining their policies, or doing walkabouts in markets, in food centers, and trying to reach every citizen, including those who may be incubating the virus and asymptomatic. So it's super risky. And in fact, you know that the SDP has long argued that we can wait to phase 3 when things are quietened down, when we have 0 or 1 infection in total, either inside or outside the dormitories. Then it'll be a lot safer. I mean, there's no great hurry. The elections don't have to be called until April 2021. And that's just a campaign. The voting process itself is also risky, and there have been documented infections associated with voting in Wisconsin in the United States. So I think those of us in the medical community are apprehensive about what's going to happen, not just with the lifting of phase 2, but even worse if there's an election campaign that's going to be called. But I guess we have no choice if that's the decision of the ruling party. We've got to try and do what we have to do and try and protect the public health, even if that's not the priority of them.
Next question by Yves Lee. Please give us your comment on CECA.
Right, CECA, like other trade agreements, needs to be evaluated transparency by the people. It's a huge document, and unfortunately, most trade agreements only benefit large corporations, and a lot of them actually penalize the working people. Without labor protections, they allow companies to hire workers without basic protections, such as minimum wage or standardized qualifications. There are lots of horror stories of individuals who can get by with qualifications which are not as rigorous as the local qualifications. And that's what happens. Before you have a trade agreement, it's a very standard and transparent thing. If you want to get into a profession in Singapore, you have to meet the qualifications in Singapore. There's no equivalency. When I went to the United States to do my postgraduate training, I had to sit for the United States exams. There was no such thing as, mutual recognition. And of course, I sailed through the exams because the Singapore exams are much more rigorous than the exams that they have in the United States. So basically what happens when you have trade agreements like this, which essentially are billed as free trade agreements, but in reality what they do is they're trying to help corporations reduce their costs by hiring workers who are willing to work for lower pay, who are not necessarily more qualified than the local workers. And I can tell you, when the SDP is elected into parliament, you can be sure we will ask for detailed reviews of all of our free trade agreements to ensure that it's not just the corporations, but it's people who benefit.
Thank you. So for the next question by Benny Mohayat, why are we still hosting over 400,000 foreign workers? Why can't Singaporeans fill these jobs if the jobs are well paid?
Now that is precisely the point. We need to have these jobs paid fairly so that the best qualified person, whether you're Singaporean or non-Singaporean, you can get the job and do it well. Now, I've often heard people say that, oh, these are dirty jobs which Singaporeans don't want to do. Now, let me tell you about a friend of mine, okay? Let's call him Dr. K. He's a colorectal surgeon. He spends his days and nights looking at and handling other people's poop. Now, it's a dirty job in anyone's book, but there's a long line of Singaporeans, I can tell you, every year competing for colorectal surgery traineeships. It may have something to do with the fact that Dr. K has 2 cars, or that everyone calls him doctor. So the point is that once people who do so-called dirty jobs are treated with respect and paid a fair wage, I can tell you Singaporeans will do those jobs. Singaporeans are not, kind of namby-pamby individuals who just shun hard work. I can tell you that. That's for sure. In countries like Japan, Korea, Australia, construction work is done by locals. And that's because there is a minimum wage and there's some protection. I was in Australia in November. It seems like an eternity ago. And there was a construction site next to the hotel where I was staying at, near the convention center. And as I walked past the construction site, I said, something looks different. A construction site like that in Singapore would have 20 workers, would have a truck, would have, people digging here and there. But there was one construction worker there with 5 machines. And what he was doing, he also had a boombox and a 6-pack of beer at the side. But what he was doing is he was setting off the machines and getting the work done. And construction work in developed countries has got a very high level of productivity because the construction workers are skilled individuals who are paid well and treated with a certain amount of respect. Now, Singapore, unfortunately, is trapped in the same kind of situation like Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, where we are addicted to cheap foreign labor. And that actually is exploitation. It's exploitation of these people who come from other countries. They're looking for a fair job. And in fact, they're earning money here, which may be more than what they're earning back home, but they have to spend some of the money here. And Singapore is a really expensive place to live. So basically, for years, the SDP has called for a minimum wage. And when you have a minimum wage, that's going to be fair to everyone, Singaporean or local otherwise. So that's again, the short answer to this long question. The reason why we have all these foreign workers here is because of a resistance to paying a fair wage to everybody, Singaporean or foreigners alike.
Thank you. So now we'll be taking some live questions from our live viewers. The first live question that we have is, Singapore is opening up for business travelers. Are we doing enough to prevent imported cases? The question is by Richard Franklin.
Okay, that's a good question. And countries all over the world are concerned about this. And what they're doing in Singapore is we're doing swab tests, and then we are quarantining individuals under stay-at-home notice or staying in controlled government quarantine facilities for 2 weeks. And that's probably enough, but there's a lot of pressure to relax on this. So I think it's going to be challenging. In my mind, the ideal situation is if we had a really good rapid test that could tell you, whether you're immune to the virus or whether you're a carrier. And this is not new. I don't know if any of you have ever traveled to Brazil or to South America or East Africa. I haven't, but if you do travel to these countries, because I used to run a travel clinic, you have to get a yellow book, which has the WHO certification, which certifies that you're vaccinated against yellow fever before you're allowed to travel to those countries. So, I think hopefully in a short period of time, we'll be able to have safe travel for people moving across different countries.
Thank you. So the next live question we have by Peter Andrew is, once the vaccine is out, will we get the vaccine, and how long will we have to wait for these to be in effect? Okay,
the sad reality though is that the vaccine is going to take a while before it comes out. It's probably going to come out, at the earliest at the end of this year, or maybe in the first quarter of the next year. And I can tell you the government is trying really hard to make sure that we get access to the vaccine. Problem is that there is no vaccine manufacturing in Singapore. So we are forced to depend on foreign vaccine manufacturing companies, and they're trying to negotiate contracts, they're trying to provide the facilities to do testing for the vaccine. And everybody's trying to get the vaccine. You may have seen that the European Union has made a deal for 300 million doses of the vaccine with one of the drug companies. And I'm pretty sure that the government will make a similar deal if they can find somebody who's willing to make a deal with us. So it's a huge challenge. And with this virus, there's the additional issue that we have to be very careful about the vaccine, because the vaccine has to be able to protect us. And we don't want to make it a situation where the vaccine makes it worse. Just like, there was one of the dengue vaccines where people who took the dengue vaccine actually had the risk of getting more complications because the immune system got kind of overactive.
Okay, so next question, even though it's kind of covered already, what is the earliest time for a probable vaccine by Alvin?
Yeah, there's actually trials that are underway right now. There's a Chinese vaccine, which is actually a kill virus. What they do is they grow up the virus, then they kill the virus, and then they give it to you. And this is similar to what is done for like the flu vaccine, you know, where they grow the flu virus in chicken eggs, and then they kill it or they inactivate it, and it works fairly well most of the time as long as you get the right strain. So that vaccine is probably the furthest along. There's also a vaccine developed by a group from Oxford, and there is another group by a US company, and those are using novel technologies which have not really been tested before for other vaccines. So it's going to take a while. You know, I would, like I said, my bet is probably the earliest we will get a vaccine which is licensed for use would be somewhere around November, December, which actually is probably just in time for the Northern Hemisphere winter. So, you know, it's going to take a while, but hopefully it will be in time to have an impact on maybe the next wave of this virus.
So for one of the last questions for this segment, what is your opinion on opposition unity in the upcoming elections by Sairesh Pillai?
Okay, that's a good question. And you know, frankly, the reality is that the opposition is united because all of us agree on a common goal. We want a free and democratic Singapore. We want to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, which is what we say every day in our pledge. But you know, unity is not the same as uniformity. It doesn't mean we all have to wear the same uniform, we all have to sing the same song. And that's the strength of a democratic society, is that you have unity and diversity. And you know, unity also doesn't mean you don't have competition. You know, you have a football team, you have 3 strikers, they all, you know, they know that for the team to win, they have to be on the same side, they have to make sure that they score the goals. But that doesn't mean that the 3 strikers are not going to try and be the top scorer. So there's a lot of talk about, you know, 3-corner fight and all that kind of thing. But the reality is that the Singaporean voting public is a sophisticated one, and they will be able to make their choices on their own. You know, we know who is good, who is credible, who has the heart and the well-being of Singaporeans at heart. So I'm not concerned about that because I think that all the credible opposition parties have the well-being of Singaporeans at heart. These are people who really care about Singapore, you know, because it takes a lot of effort. You know, friends, relatives, they're going to tell you, why are you doing this? You know, why you're risking, you know, losing your job, all this kind of thing. But these are people who feel that Singapore could be a better place. And I can tell you, I met so many of them from different parties, and they just have different ways of looking at things. So I'm quite optimistic about opposition unity in the coming general elections.
Thank you, Prof. That was the last question for today. Thank you for a very insightful session.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, thank you all. I think it's been an interesting session. I originally thought it was all going to be about COVID, but it looks like people have elections on their mind. And so I'd just like you all to practice good hand hygiene, social distancing, wear a mask when you go out, and see a doctor if you don't feel well. Thank you all again.